I'm Patrick Steyaert, and so I work with organizations using Kanban to improve flow. So there's an element of change in that. Now the last half a year, I've also been working with organizations, with companies, just to deliver change. And so I've been using Kanban as a way to deliver change, not as the target of improving flow. And so that's where, for me, the idea of improvement Kanban came about. So I'm going to give a presentation about improvement Kanban, and actually the improvement Kanban boards are right at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to tax your patience a little bit. So it's quite almost the opposite of Ian's session. You show all the boards, and I'll show the boards at the end. So the idea is actually very simple. So with Kanban, we try to improve flow. So we use visualization to make the work visible. And through that, in the visualization and then imposing WIP limits, we manage and improve the flow. And so visualization plays an important role in that. So with Kanban, we make visible what was not visible before. And then through WIP limits, we catalyze or we tend to catalyze a certain change. Now, most of the time, that change remains itself. That change itself, it remains quite invisible. Okay, so maybe some teams do visualize the change, but then that's a visualization that has not been. It's not really methodologically supported by the Kanban methods. Okay, so we might see some visualization, but it's not really the subject of. It's not that same type of visualization, or not to the same extent that we're visualizing the flow of work. Okay, so with improvement Kanban, this is exactly the purpose of improvement Kanban, is to the same extent that we're visualizing the flow of work, to visualize the flow of change. So there's some kind of inversion of reasoning that is behind this, and that is that with Kanban we catalyze change through visualization, through work in progress limits. What we're looking at here is through visualization of the change and through Kanbanizing the change, we try to catalyze a flow. So quite the other way around. So we think that there's lots of value in that. Now, as with any Kanban system, if we want to implement a Kanban system, we need to understand the underlying process very well. We need to, with the Kanban of work, we need to understand the system of work. If we want to implement a Kanban for change, we need to understand the system for change. Okay. Now that's where the problem is. That's where we get into quite a mess. We've worked ourselves in some kind of Tower of Babel. So change, the words that we use for change, we have a lot of words that we use for it. Evolutionary change, Kaizen, Kaikaku, plant change, and there's lots of different terminology, and everybody has their own understanding, and there's lots of terminological confusion. There's lots of misconception also. I'm pretty sure that a lot of people use the term evolutionary change while in a way that it was not intended. Maybe even it's a plant change. So there's quite some confusion here. There's also some polarization. As Kanban coaches, we like evolutionary change, and that's a very pragmatic. It's very much from the person that are actually doing the work. That's very much a perspective from the people that are doing the work. While much of from an organizational perspective, much of management, still yields to a large extent the plant change approach. And that creates kind of a tension, a polarization. So we've worked ourselves in quite a little bit of a mess. And so before we can start designing improvement Kanban systems to visualize that change, to manage that change, we need to kind of get a grip on this. We need to understand the system of change before we can design a Kanban for change. So what I'll do, and this will be a large part of the presentation, what I'll do is I'm going to use constraints as more recently been talked about by Alicia Guerrero. Constraints to identify or to better understand different types of change. Okay? So I hope I get, the details might be not completely correct, but I think the gist of it will be correct. Okay? So I'm going to use the constraints as identified by Alicia Guerrero in terms of understanding complexity in terms of constraints. I'm going to understand change in terms of constraints. Okay? So I'll be talking about plant change, retrospective change, evolutionary change, and directed change. And I'm going to look at it from a constraint perspective. Now, I do want to give you a little bit of a heads up on what I mean with these constraints. We'll talk about unconstrained, over-constraint, enabling constraint, and governing constraints. So I do want to give you a little bit of intuition at this point about what we mean by those constraints. So I'm going to use the example of a soccer team and the coach of the soccer team. Okay? So have you ever seen play the small kids? Yeah? Under 8, little kids? It's pretty unconstrained, right? Okay? It's pretty unconstrained. They're all kind of moving independently from each other. You don't see a lot of a game being developed, right? The ball goes this way, the ball goes that way, and it gets kicked around. Okay? So that's pretty much unconstrained. Okay? Now, a youth coach might intervene. Okay, might intervene. And if it's not a very up-to-date youth coach, maybe not a very good youth coach, he might try to over-constrain the kids. Okay? So what he'll do is pick one kid out and says, you are going to stand in front of the goal and you're going to defend the goal. So he'll over-constrain the situation. Okay? So that's over-constraining. And what you will see is the ball is 1 meter away from this kid. He doesn't touch the ball, right? So it's over-constrained because the coach told him so. Okay? Now, over-constraining is not always a bad thing. It can have a function. It's still, you need to recognize it. Now, the coach might think, well, that's over-constraining, so maybe I'll need to put in some ideal in here, some governing constraint. Okay? So we're in the UK, right? So I can say Real Madrid, right? He might say Real Madrid as this is our ideal team for us. Okay? So try to play. It might be a little bit stretched for those kids. You might use another team. Try to play as this team. So it's not over-constraining. It's giving a direction to the kids that biases their decision-making towards that direction. Okay? So that's a governing constraint. Okay? Now, modern coaches that have been trained in modern coaching techniques, what they'll do is they'll recognize constraints not only as limiting, but also as enabling. Okay? So he'll try to put in some enabling constraints. Okay? What he'll say, the modern coach, is he'll say, okay, don't attack the kid with the ball. That's an enabling constraint. Don't attack the kid with the ball. It's enabling because it'll enable novel behavior. It'll enable creativity in the kids. Because by not being able to attack the kid with the ball, the kids will need to start collaborating. Yeah? They will need to start collaborating because they will need to start not running at the ball, but they will need to start running at the players of the opposing team. And they will need to start defending against the opposing team. So it enables creative behavior. And that's actually a very modern way of coaching, making small games and putting enabling constraints in those small games. Okay? Now what you see here is the enabling constraints enable creative behavior, but they also change, they shift the nature of the game. Yeah? It becomes a different game. Yeah? You start seeing a game develop. Okay? So we'll use those to identify or understand different types of change. What I'll also be doing is to use fitness landscape as a way to evaluate the effect of different types of change. Okay? So fitness landscape, who's familiar with fitness landscapes? So it's used in evolutionary biology, okay, as a way to visualize the relationship between the genotype, or genes, yeah, and then fitness in terms of, so the genotypes are a kind of search space, a multidimensional search space, yeah? And the fitness, which is the height of the landscape, yeah, is a representation of the reproductive success. Yeah? So the fitness of a certain genotype. Okay? We'll do, in a metaphorical way, we'll do kind of the same thing. Our search space is the practices, a particular combination of practices that a team is using. That's the genotype of the team. Okay? We're using a certain iteration length, we're doing pair programming, or not. Yeah? So that's kind of the genotype of the team. Okay? And then the fitness is the fitness for purpose of the team. As we maybe also use in Kanban, is a fitness for purpose in terms of your delivery time, your quality, your predictability, safety, stuff like that. So that's the height of the fitness landscape. So you can imagine this metaphorically as a certain landscape, and then improvement is moving around in this landscape. One particular movement can be following the gradient or the slope of the landscape. So moving in a direction, seeing whether you're moving up. If you're moving up, you keep on moving up until you reach the top. Okay, so that's hill climbing. Okay. Some improvement can be a movement in the landscape, but it can also be actually changing the landscape, like we had with our soccer team. Yeah? A really paradigm shift, a shift from one type of game to another type of game will be a complete shift of the landscape. I will show that. Okay, so we'll start with plant and retrospective change. So a little bit the opposite ends. Okay. So on the plant side, so what we typically, I don't need to explain this, I guess everybody is familiar with that. We set a standard, and then by setting that before we actually go into action. Okay, we set a standard before going into action, and that standard might be about what needs to be done, how it has to be done, by whom, in what timing. Okay, and often, it's not necessarily so, but what is often the case, because we set a standard, we separate the thinking from the doing, we tend to over-constrain the doing. There's little freedom for the people that are actually doing the work in terms of choosing how to do the work, because we've set up front what needs to be done, how it needs to be done, in what timing, by whom. Okay, so it's over-constraining. The archetypical example of this is Ford flow production, mass production. That's the archetypical example. Ford found himself in a situation where he needed to produce a high quantity at a low cost in a very simple process. One color, one model, over 20 years, in a very simple process. And he did so by using Frederick Taylor's method of standardized work, division of labor, and separating, in the end, separating the thinking from the doing. So first think out how the work should be done, and then actually doing the work. Okay. So on the other side, on the opposite side, we see retrospective change. So retrospective change is popularized by agile development methods like Scrum. It's about after the action, after doing something, we have an after action review. Okay, we have a retrospective. This is kind of very unconstraining in the sense that we ask what went well, what do we need to keep, what can we improve, what can we learn from this. So it's very much unconstraining. If there's a standard, even the standard can be put into its ideal form. If there is a standard, even the standard can be put into question. Okay? So it's very unconstraining. So it's a good example of reflective observation. Yeah? So reflective observation in terms of if we do our work in a day-to-day way, we observe, we orient, we act. We're guided, implicitly guided by our experience, our habits, our dispositions. By having an explicit step of decision, we try to include some rational choice in there. Some reflective observation through this after action or retrospective change. Planned retrospective change in the landscape, in the fitness landscape, is the retrospective change is making affordable steps. Through the retrospective change, we're not going to be doing big steps. We'll limit ourselves to what is affordable. And so we're making small steps around in the landscape. So an explorative walk in the landscape. Now, in absence of any explicit fitness for purpose criteria, in absence of any explicit evaluation criteria, this is a blind walk, right? We're walking around in a landscape in a blind way. So there's quite a danger of just doing a random walk. Okay? And many teams, you see that happening with pure retrospectives, that they actually do some kind of random walk in the landscape. Okay? Especially in landscapes that are very chaotic, which is most often the case when we have a very unstable process. Okay? Plant changes. So what is typical for both plant and retrospective change is that we don't track the landscape. Yeah? We just the plant change. It's like teleportation. It's a big jump, but it's like teleportation. We dial into a certain location, a certain combination of practices, right? We dial into a certain location, and we teleport to that location. We make a big jump to that location. And if we're successful, we actually end up in that location, yeah? But we don't know what the landscape is, okay? So the chance by doing that we land on top of a hill is pretty small, yeah? It's very small, actually. Yeah? There's more chance that you land in a valley than landing on the top of a hill, okay? Especially, again, if your process is a very unstable process, yeah, the only thing that you will do with your teleportation is jump from one mess to another mess, okay? So that's, both are examples of concave change. Even if the change is successful in terms of implementation, in terms of adoption, even if it's successful in terms of adoption, the expected gain is capped to a certain maximum, yeah? Because there's no learning process in it, okay? Because we're not tracking the landscape, we're just jumping, yeah? We can only expect a maximum amount of gain, and most often the case, the pain is even greater than the gain. Okay. Now, the concave change is what many organizations are most familiar with. So obviously what we want is a convex change, a change where small changes can accumulate in big outcomes. If the change is successful, and it might be many small changes, they accumulate into big outcomes. Now, often I feel that that is a large part of the problem, is that most people are not familiar and haven't experienced this type of change, so they don't believe in it. Okay. So convex change, so typically supported by a learning process. So by active experimentation, we have some model of the landscape in our head. Okay. We have some hypotheses in terms of, we believe that by doing a certain change that we will achieve a certain outcome. Okay. We do it. We do the experiment. We devise an experiment for validating our hypothesis. We check the results, and if the results are positive, we can continue. If they're negative, we might abandon. But in any case, we will have learned something about the landscape. Okay, we will have learned something. So the traditional PDCA loop underlies this. The archetypical example here is obviously Toyota. Unlike Ford, Toyota found itself in a more complex situation, having to deliver multiple models, multiple colors, accessories on the same production line. And they realized that they couldn't separate the thinking from the doing anymore. So they required a lot of input from the people that are actually doing the work in terms of organizing the work through active experimentation, because they found themselves in a more complex environment. So Toyota developed this into what I call a directed change. So not just a active experimentation in the wild, but active experimentation with some kind of goal. So the goal is some ideal future state, and we try to actively experiment to find out how we can achieve that ideal future state. Okay. Often that ideal future state, or at least in the case of Toyota, that ideal future state is expressed as some kind of true north. A true north, which is a guiding star, and helps bias the decisions of people in a certain direction. Okay? So it's not an over-constraining, it's more of a guidance, a direction, that you offer to people to make decisions, to bias their decisions. Okay? The reasoning behind it is that people, when they're changing, they're often confronted with a hard trade-off. Okay? Like the trade-off here between resource efficiency and flow efficiency, which many people, or if people that are not, that have not experienced this, find themselves think about it as contradictory. Yeah? So it's a hard trade-off. The guiding star, the true north, in this case, one-piece flow, helps people to break that trade-off and to find a way to both have flow efficiency as well as resource efficiency. So it's kind of really literally in your landscape, it's kind of a guiding star that helps you to direct yourself to the high peaks in the landscape. Okay. Evolutionary change, as we know it in the Kanban method, is directed change without a governing constraint, right? It is active experimentation, without that guiding light, that true north. So the idea here is, we start where we are right now. We define a safe to fail experiment, and we execute that experiment, and we evaluate it with respect to our fitness criteria. Okay. So what we're actually doing here is navigating, trying to hill climb tracking the landscape, hill climbing the landscape, trying to climb up to up in a peak in the landscape. Okay. Now there's something more under the hood here that is not visible through this, because you could consider this as retrospective change with fitness criteria, right? There's something more under the hood, and that is the enabling constraints, which are the work in progress limits. Okay, work in progress limits really act as enabling constraints. Okay, they enable novel behavior, and especially they enable collaborative behavior. They create dependencies between people. They need to collaborate in order to make the work flow, in order to stay within the limits. Okay, so they enable, just like with the football team, with the soccer team, they enable creative behavior. But there's still something more, which is it's really the WIP limits that actually enable the ability to do evolutionary change. Okay, so without WIP limits, your flow is not stable. Okay, so if you don't have a stable flow, so that means that your metrics are all over the place. Okay, try to do experimentation when your metrics is all over the place. You won't be able to distinguish the signal from the noise. So your metrics go up after an experiment. It might be just the random variation because your flow is unstable. Okay, so in order to do evolutionary change, we first need to stabilize our flow, and that's the function of our WIP limits. Okay, so what the WIP limits, actually the enabling constraint, do is, this is our landscape before with an unstable flow. It's a chaotic landscape. Yeah, and what the enabling constraints actually do is they transform that landscape in a landscape where you can actually do hill climbing. It's a more stable landscape. Okay. So this brings me to kind of a central idea. That is, each of these constraints, each of these types of change have a function. Each of these constraints have a function in the landscape, have a certain role to play in the landscape. Enabling constraints have a role to play in terms of stabilizing the landscape. Active experimentation has the role to play of hill climbing, trying to find peaks. Retrospective and plan change have the role to play in terms of doing exploration, just wandering around and stumbling upon something. Okay, so each of these constraints and each of these types of change have a role to play in the change. So rather than sticking to one type of change, even if it's evolutionary change, rather than sticking to one type of change, I think we need to change the way we change and take a more ecological approach, more like a person that is creating an ecology. Yeah, you need to enable a little bit. You need to put in some species that enables other species. Just like we had plants that made oxygen, and that oxygen made animal life possible. Okay, so we need to look at it more from that perspective, more of like a gardener or a creator of an ecology, rather than just one person with one tool and saying we're going to do one type of change only. Yeah. Now, in order to do so, I admit we do need to overcome a number of obstacles. And one obstacle is the polarity or the perceived contradiction between organization and evolution. Okay? So most of the teams are not completely independent teams. They work in an organization. Because from a team perspective, you want to have an evolutionary change, you want to optimize the working of the team by the team in their own particular way. So you want to have an evolutionary perspective from a team. But from an organization perspective, you might want to have standards, okay? Because teams need to work together, or they need to collaborate. That's the same thing, or they need to share experiences, okay? So there might be a little bit of a polarity between those two. Okay. Now, from a Kanban perspective or from a team perspective, we might say, yeah, but the organization part, the standards and stuff like that, they lead to conformance, they lead to cargo cult, they lead to disengagement. And look at all these advantages of evolution. We create fitness for purpose, we create engagement, we create learning. Okay? And that's a general tendency that you see often. We only look at the negatives and of the other view and the positives of our own view, right? But obviously, evolution might also have its disadvantages. You might have teams that go in isolation, that drift away. Yeah? Maybe there's no sharing, the not invented here syndrome. And obviously, from having an organizational perspective and standardization on an organizational level might create alignment, might create synergies, might create possibilities for reuse. Yeah? So we need to better manage that polarity. Yeah? And this is, I think, the real practical problem that most changes are coping with, that polarity. I don't have all the answers. I don't have the complete answer there. But just one example that can be useful is experience sharing. Okay, experience sharing across teams, right? So purely evolutionary change. Yeah? Within independent teams, we're doing modification and selection in those independent teams. Yeah? That's kind of asexual reproduction. Yeah? Now, if we do cross-team knowledge sharing, experience sharing, what our teams are doing, they're exchanging DNA with each other. Yeah? So sexual reproduction. Okay? So this can help to speed up, on the one hand, the evolution of the individual teams, but also help to set standards across teams. Okay? So that's a way to break that polarity, to break that trade-off. Okay? Now, for doing so, in order to support the change process in a more ecological way, obviously, we need, on the one hand, we need to have a process for learning, okay? So the processes that we already touched upon in terms of reflective observation, observe, orient, decide, act, from the unfolding events, like the retrospective change, okay? So that's our eyes and ears into the teams, okay? But on the other hand, we also need active participation, and they need to, the PDCA, and they need to go hand in hand. So we need to have a complete learning process from just the unfolding events on the one hand, and our model of what we think that the landscape is, and both need to go hand in hand. But we also need a process for doing, plain doing in terms of implementing change. Not everything is learning. Sometimes we need to just do. So just doing in terms of exploring practices and exploring possibilities, creating options for change, and then on the other hand, actually implementing those changes. Okay. So here's the two Kanban boards that I promised. So the Kanban for learning. So based on the reflective observation, active experimentation, UDA, PDCA. Yeah? What we're putting up here is a board, on the one hand, to help teams across the teams to collaborate. If you want to have experience sharing across teams to collaborate around learning. On the one hand, on the left-hand side, more around what are we observing, reflective observation, what observations are we making. On the right-hand side, more in terms of what experiments are we doing and what are we learning from those experiments. Okay, so that's the learning part. And then obviously we also need a Kanban for doing. Yeah? A Kanban just for implementing practices. Okay? So there's an upstream part in terms of evaluating practices and preparing those practices for actual implementation. So that's the upstream part. And there's a downstream part in terms of actually implementing those practices. And again, you want to make that feasible. You want both the learning as well as the doing. You want to make that feasible in order for teams to be able to collaborate around that and share experiences around that. Okay. So that kind of sums it up in terms of improvement Kanban. So changing the way we change, using constraints to understand different types of change. There's lots of confusion, I think, and that confusion does not help to put it into practice. Okay, so I think a clear understanding and clearly being able to differentiate different types of change and recognizing the value of each through the constraints and through their impact on the fitness landscape can help practitioners take a more ecological approach. So not just the one size fits all, but a really thinking about, at this point in time, with this team, with this organization, what is the best way to approach it? Maybe we need to do some plant change. Maybe we need to do some enabling here, stabilize the process, and then we can do some evolutionary change. So a more ecological approach is in order. In order to do so, we need to manage the polarity between organization and evolution, because those two often seem to be at odds with each other. Okay, and then experience sharing can be a mechanism, but I'm pretty sure that there's other mechanisms out there also. But surely, using a Kanban system for managing that change, making the change visible, and managing that change through a Kanban system can truly help to better manage that polarity. And that's it. Just in time. Any questions?
So I think I came to a similar conclusion on what I think you call the ecological approach, in discussing this thing about evolution as a sort of small step exploration of the fitness landscape. There's no way to make jumps. Actually, the way you make jumps is by having multiple experiments running independently, rather than thinking that this one Kanban system can be improved to command a completely different peak. But you have multiple organisms coexisting.
Yeah.
At the moment, this doesn't look very good. Then the fitness landscape changes, and they're suddenly on a peak. So I really like that. My sort of contrasting evolutionary change with directed change or whatever. And I guess my real feeling is that evolution happens to you anyway. Well, it either happens to you, you can use it. And so it's really the question of whether evolution happens inside your organisation or it happens to your organisation and then you disappear.
Yeah. So I do think there's a role to play for directed change, in the sense that evolution happens, but we have our own purpose and we have our own volition. Yeah, we're not animals,
well,
right?
And that's why with directed change can happen faster. And
exactly.
If you're right, you're at the top of a peak. If you're wrong, you disappear.
Well, yeah. And in practice, for me, it's not. Yeah, maybe there's an element of speed, but in practice, for me, sometimes people need a guiding star, right? Just to a lot of Kanban implementations do stall, and I think they stall to a large extent because we're only employing one mechanism of change. We're not employing the full tool sets. And so having some guiding true north, some guiding light, sometimes can help people to go over a certain hill. But we need to deploy the full tool set and not just one tool. Okay.
question. So how would you position your findings against something like the lean change method, which also advocates using Kanban?
Yeah.
The other end is Japanese.
Yeah. So I do think lean change is one of the might be confusing. Yeah, might be confusing. So the board that the boards that I've got in the beginning of this the board that I've got in the beginning of the slides here is actually an example from lean change. Okay, and so that's one of the places I think where we need to have a little bit more intellectual rigor. If you look at lean change here, it says like validate adoption, which might lead you to think that it's an evolutionary type of change. Okay, verify performance. Yeah, which might lead you to think that it's more of an evolutionary type of change, while my feeling is that a lot of it is still plant change. Yeah, so it's not entirely clear for me, is this now employing a plant change or an evolutionary type of change?
In that method, it depends. And the change is co-created with perhaps a guiding star or some other objective. So I'm just curious whether these things are compatible. To me, they seem compatible. There may be confusion in terms, and terminology that's used, because the pedigree of the lean change method is the culture model, for example. So,
yeah.
I'm just curious as to whether you've looked at comparing the two, synchronizing them.
Well, not literally comparing, but so my intuitive feeling is there is a little bit of overlap. What I try to do is separate it all out a little bit more, so that we know better in terms of what are we doing at this point, what are we doing at this point. I think having confusion there actually hinders change, can hinder change. Yeah. So we need to be very careful. For example, don't start trying to start doing experiments if you didn't stabilize the process first. Right? Making that clear. Yeah, making that clear. And that's maybe not entirely clear in the lean change.
So I agree. I think, well, the driving force there is a minimum viable change, right? So what is viable? And I think some guidance would be nice.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Ask everybody to leave feedback.